Major General Gregg F. Martin cut a striking figure in the Army. Athletic, quick-witted, devout, and studious, he was a natural leader. General Martin served on active duty for 36 years. He is a graduate of West Point Military Academy, became an airborne ranger, and was commissioned as an officer in the Army Corps of Engineers. He commanded an engineer unit in the 130th Engineer Brigade in combat during the first year of the Iraq War in 2003 to 2004, including the attack from Kuwait, up the Euphrates River Valley, to Baghdad and beyond. In addition to being a combat veteran, Major General Gregg Martin is a bipolar survivor and an Army strategist.
I was born in Holbrook, Massachusetts, near Boston, and right from the beginning, unknowingly, I had a bipolar brain. I had the genetics for bipolar disorder really from birth. And the way it characterized itself was with extremely high energy, drive, enthusiasm, problem-solving skills, creativity. And so by the time I was in high school, I was like the all-star student athlete leader. Then I went to West Point, more of the same, Army Ranger School. Then as an Army officer, I did fantastically well as a troop leader. Everything I touched turned to gold. We not only were the best at everything we did in terms of our Army mission, we won all the sports competition. And we were just the champions of everything. So what I didn't realize, though, is I had a mental condition called hyperthymia, which is a near continuous state of low-level mania, which gave me, my brain was producing and distributing all that extra dopamine and endorphins, which gave me all this extra energy and drive. But it carried me and it made me better, and it gave me a huge advantage as an Army leader. But the problem with hyperthymia is, as I was slowly climbing up the bipolar spectrum, I then went into real mania during the Iraq War when I was 47 years old in 2003. And what the VA and the Army Medical Department, they each did independent investigations. And the question was, how did General Martin come down with bipolar disorder in his 50s? And so what happened was the extreme pressure, trauma, thrill, euphoria, all of those things together essentially triggered my genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. And when we attacked from Kuwait into Iraq on the ground, I shot into mania. I felt like Superman, bulletproof, was all over the battlefield. My mind was laser sharp. I felt like I could do literally anything. I would anticipate and solve problems before anybody else even knew there was a problem. And it carried me. I did incredibly well during that year in Iraq, but things were about to change.
And now I want to ask a question, because we have people who are superstars. They're high energy, and we just call them, we laud them, especially as entrepreneurs, as officers, as enlisted people in the military. Those are your people, that the go-to people. And so how, or did you even realize that this energy, this high energy that you had, even as a teenager? And I want you to go back and talk a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was also part of my hyperthymia. I mean, I already had a lot of natural talents and abilities, but this hyperthymic condition, by surging these extra powerful chemicals into my brain, they elevated everything I did. They boosted my performance. They made me better. And so everything I did, I was hyper-focused, hyper-enthusiastic, incredible energy. I had amazing problem-solving abilities, extremely creative. I was a flaming extrovert, so I got along great with people. I loved being around people and being the leader of the team. And that just carried me through high school, college, the Army, and it just kept increasing until I was right on the verge of bipolar onset in my 40s. And then the Iraq experience triggered it. It triggered real bipolar. And of course, I never realized there was anything wrong until years later. So after the Iraq experience, we went back to home station in Germany, and I crashed into depression for 10 months. And I went to the doctor a few times and said, "Hey, doc, I'm normally high energy. Now I'm depressed." And so we had a conversation, and they said, "Well, what do you do to deal with your depression?" And I said, "Well, I try to do intense physical training, which is very hard when you're depressed. I listen to inspirational rock and roll music verses out of the Bible to give me strength and inspiration. And when that stuff doesn't work, I drink alcohol after duty." And the doctor said, "Oh, you're fine. You're fit for duty." But they were totally wrong. And so then over the next 11 years from Iraq forward until I got fired, retired, and hospitalized, for 11 years, my mania got higher and higher. My depression got lower and lower. I started getting more and more bizarre in my behavior until by 2014, age 58, I went into full-blown mania, which is essentially a state of madness or insanity where I lost my mind and my behaviors became so bizarre, over the top, that in the past, people hadn't noticed anything. They didn't know what was wrong, but my bipolar disorder was unrecognized, undetected, undiagnosed. But by the summer of 2014, it was apparent to everybody that something was wrong. And at that point, they started writing anonymous letters to my boss, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I got a call from the boss saying, "Report to my office Monday morning." And I was in full-blown mania. I thought I was going to get promoted. Instead, I went in, and the chairman came across his office, gave me a hug, and he said, "Gregg, I love you like a brother. You've done an unbelievable job. I give you a grade of A+ in your duty performance, but your time at National Defense University is over. You have until 5 p.m. today to resign, or I'll fire you. And I'm giving you a command order to go get a mental health evaluation this week at Walter Reed." And you would think I would be disappointed. I wasn't at all. I said, "Thank you, Chairman. This is great news because God put me here to do great things. And now he's putting me somewhere else." And ironically, 10 years later, I am actually doing the most important work of my life with this bipolar mental health advocacy.
General, one of the things that you talk about is the delusions and some people even suffer from hallucinations. But when we hear about bipolar, we think bipolar is just the spectrum of manic or depressive. In fact, there are three different types of bipolar. There's bipolar 1, there's bipolar 2, and then there's cyclothymia. And with bipolar 1, which sounds like you had at one point, is really characterized by the real high manic episodes. That's when people starts to go off the rails. However, with bipolar 2, you have that hypomania. And I'm wondering, during the hypomanic phases where you have the energy, but you don't have the delusion, you're not out of your mind, people can't tell that, oh, something is wrong with the general. How did that benefit you? And as a consequence, how does that benefit others who are high performers, whether they're in the military or outside of the military?
That's a fantastic question. So this idea of hypothymia is below the level of real mania, as they call it. And what it does is your brain produces and distributes excess amounts of dopamine, endorphins, other powerful chemicals, and it gives you a boost. So extra energy, drive, enthusiasm, creativity, problem-solving skills. So as an Army leader, I was like Superman. I could work continuously. I had great ideas all the time. I could work into the night. I didn't need hardly any sleep. And it was just an amazing advantage that was given to me through this hypothymia. And so it was a big advantage. And you find a lot of people, entrepreneurs, leaders, artists, musicians, entertainers, many of them have bipolar disorder, and it gives them an advantage, a boost, enhances their performance until it goes too high or too low, and then it can destroy you.
How can people who are around someone with bipolar who is undiagnosed, because that's the problem. There are people who are undiagnosed, but they're showing some symptoms of mania, maybe it's hypomania. How do we as entrepreneurs, whether it's there are people who work for us, or what's even tougher, people who are our superiors like yourself, in terms of approaching a person who's hypomanic?
Well, the first thing is people need to be educated and trained on what are the symptoms of the various mental illnesses. Like for me, I was around thousands of people for over a decade, but nobody could see what the symptoms were because they were untrained and uneducated. So the first thing, there needs to be a level of training. And it's really not that difficult with bipolar disorder to identify what are the symptoms of mania, what do they look like, what are the symptoms of depression. I mean, you could literally get a quick education in 5 minutes by going online to get the basics. Then the second thing is you need to have a culture that says, look, we're going to be open about mental health. This is just like physical health, and we're not going to be ashamed or embarrassed or stigmatized by it. The third thing is if you're on an equal footing with the person and your peers and you detect something wrong, I would say you should have a conversation and say, hey, look, Jane, or Tom, I'm noticing some disturbing behaviors in you, and here's what I'm seeing, and I'm concerned that you may have some kind of mental health condition or disorder. Let's go see a medical professional and get evaluated and get looked at, and I'll go with you, and let's invite your spouse and a family member so we can go in together and have a friendly conversation with the doctor. And also the doctor can get more collateral information from these different people if they're there together. So, and then you go together as a friendly kind of team building effort. Now, let's say that the person you see problem is General Martin, and he's a 2-star general, and you're below that level. What do you do? I think you should talk to your battle buddy, your peers, and say, hey, I'm really seeing some troubling behaviors in General Martin. I think I agree with you. It's too much to go for a lower ranking person to go to a higher ranking person. It's too much. It's not going to happen. But that high ranking person, like in my case, I was a 2-star general. I had 1 and 2-star generals that worked for me. I had about a dozen ambassadors that worked for me. I had about 24 senior executive service who worked for me. So they were like lateral people to me. Even though I was the commander, they were very high ranking. If I got mad at them, there's nothing I can do to someone of that rank and stature. You just can't. And so people could have gone to those other high ranking people and said, hey, we need an intervention. Hey, ambassador or general, can you go talk to General Martin? I'm seeing a problem here. But that never happened in my case. I don't know why, but it should have, but it didn't. But the other thing that happens is people are intimidated by the rank and the success. So for me, both the people in my command and the doctors that evaluated me, they saw success, senior officer, successful combat commander, PhD, and they couldn't see past the mask that I had a serious brain disease that could kill me. They just couldn't see it. The other thing is a lot of my subordinates really liked me. It was fun. It was exciting to work in my command. We achieved great things. We were champions. And so they were worried if they hurt me and I got taken out, they'd get somebody they didn't like.
One of the hallmarks, one of the symptoms of bipolar, especially with bipolar 1, is an inflated self-esteem and a sense of grandiosity that sometimes is mistaken by, wow, this person is just a visionary. How do we tell the difference between a visionary and somebody who's grandiose that might be leading us down a path that may lead to destruction?
It's a fantastic question. I had a tremendous sense of grandiosity. I mean, I believed I was the smartest person in the world. I believed I held the key to world peace. I believed
Wow.
I thought I was an apostle sent by God to transform National Defense University and then the Department of Defense. And I totally believed that. I was given a mission to transform the National Defense University from my boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And by all accounts, I was fulfilling his vision and he was giving me great positive feedback. And so the more I worked at this and pushed on this transformation, and then got all this positive feedback from the chairman and other people, four-star generals, civilian secretaries, members of Congress, large portions of my faculty who were, PhDs and very smart, a lot of ambassadors, then it fueled my grandiosity and made it even higher. But the question there is, how do you tell whether it was grandiosity or a really high performance? Well, I had a plan that was blessed by the chairman. I was carrying out the plan. The chairman liked the plan. I got all kinds of good feedback. So was it just super high performance or was it grandiosity or was it some of both? I actually think it was some of both. I mean, I think that my sense of ego just got pumped up in this job. I mean, think about reporting to the number one military officer in the country and getting all this great feedback at the most important schoolhouse in the Department of Defense. So I think it was probably some of both. There was a lot of reality to it, but I was getting pumped up into a sense of grandiosity as well.
So what I'm hearing you say is that at times people reinforce that sense of grandiosity and the delusions that the person might be having in the country. So there's some reality to it. But how do we then distinguish? How do we tease out when it's grandiosity? Now, one thing you did say, you thought that you had a mission from God. And some people just think that. Did you actually speak that, or that's something that you thought about?
At first, I thought about it a lot. And I thought that, when I was in a state of hypomania and mania, all this extra energy and problem solving ability and all the things I was doing, I thought that that was God blessing me and giving me all these extra talents to carry out this special mission that he had ordained me to accomplish. And then over time, when I went into full blown mania and my religiosity started to really, really increase, and I started getting, more and more of a religious zealot, then I started talking about it in the open as I was, and it was mixing in with my job performance and the things that I was saying about the job. It would started to mix in. And of course, that's inappropriate and forbidden in federal government setting. You're not allowed to proselytize. It's forbidden. I don't know if it's a law or what, but I was doing it in the open, telling people that, hey, this transformation is coming from God. God has chosen me to carry this thing out, and that's what I'm doing. And all this energy I have and problem solving skills and the sharpness of my mind and my extroversion with people and ability to give persuasive speeches, this is all blessings from God to carry out this mission that he's given me. And so at that point, it was a combination of grandiosity and religiosity, and my religiosity started getting stronger and stronger until there was a period where I was doing like over 30 significant religious events, meaning a couple hours at a time, 30 events per week across 4 different churches in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, my time was just consumed with church activities, whether it was church services, Bible studies, prayer breakfast, discipleship training programs. I mean, you name it, I was doing it. And I was recruiting people to work with me in this as well. And again, that crossed the line as well.
I see that is one of the things during episodes of mania. There's a lot of boundary you're crossing the line all the time. People who are in the manic phase tend to have problems with reaching the boundaries of other people and themselves. I want to give some people. I want to give you guys some of the highlights of bipolar disorder. Um, Before we go on, and I want to give you guys an opportunity also to ask General Martin some questions, but there's an inflated sense of self-esteem and grandiosity, but there's a decreased need for sleep. So you can go for hours just doing things. And of course, that is also lauded as someone who is just in the grind. I hear it so often among entrepreneurs. You know, we can make $1 million and it's like like a hamster on a wheel. They're not sleeping. I see it on these platforms all the time, and coaches who are encouraging others to have this drive. And so knowing the difference between a normal drive, a natural drive, and a manic episode sometimes becomes very blurry. So that decreased need for sleep. Tell us about your experience with that.
Well, starting from a young age, I got very little sleep. I just didn't need it because my engine was always moving at a fast pace. So even in like high school, college, young officer, I was only getting 3 or 4 hours a night when I needed 8. But then by the time I went into full-blown mania in 2014, leading up to me being fired, I went 3 straight months with no sleep at all, like zero sleep. And what happens is when you're manic, you don't need the sleep. And then when you don't sleep, you become more and more manic. And so I was going out in the evening when my wife and son were asleep and I couldn't. I'd do hundreds of text messages and emails on my BlackBerry, and I would CC hundreds of people all around the world, whether they had anything to do with my organization or not. Then I'd go out and I would power walk around the streets of Washington, D.C. in the wee hours of the morning, or I'd ride my bike as fast as I could. And I actually would go up to the top of Capitol Hill, speed down the hill, and then hallucinate that I lifted up and was flying on my bicycle above the monuments. I would talk for hours at a time. I would talk faster and faster. My mind started going faster. I had good ideas, quote, good ideas, continuously, just bubbling out of my mind. I was late for everything. Meetings would go for hours. I would completely forget events that I even had the event and I'd completely miss it. I would go around the campus and I would just go into classrooms in auditoriums and take over. I would just take over and start talking about my concept for world peace, my role as an apostle, the transformation. And I just did that continuously. So, I mean, I was out of control, off the rails, just completely bizarre. I would, family events, I would completely forget that I had an event to do, or I would show up hours late because my mind was somewhere else. And this went on for months and months.
General, one thing that people, we hear about that and we can identify that as, okay, that's a mental illness. What we can't often identify as a mental illness is the hypomanic state, where you have the drive and you have the activity, but you're still goal directed and you don't have those flight of ideas, which is another symptom of manic depression, especially during the manic episodes where you have flights of idea. It's like you start talking about one thing and you go on to something else, and then you're on another idea, and it's just circular. People, I think that happens more during the real manic episode, the high mania, but maybe not so much in hypomania. Was that your experience? And then I'm going to ask people if you can come on, raise your hands, ask the general some questions. This is a time for us not just to learn for ourselves, but to learn so that we can look around us and see, hey, am I seeing this in my peers, in people who work for me, people who work with me, or even in myself?
To your point about your point about the mania and the hypomania, yes, for sure, the mania, the real mania, the larger mania, that is where a person pretty much, I lost my mind and went pretty much crazy. But the lower level mania, the below mania, the hypomania, that is a performance enhancement. And that's why people love it so much. They love being in that state because you feel so good, you're so happy, you have such energy, you can solve problems, laser focus. And so that's that's really a different situation, a different condition that really benefits people. But the danger of it when you're in hypomania is that you can go into real mania or you fall back into depression.
Absolutely. The thing about that, and I'm listening to you, and I can imagine people trying to ride your coattails because you have the energy, the drive, the ideas, and to say, oh, wow, this person is going places. And I see Tiffany just raised her hand. So I'm going to go to Tiffany in a minute. But people want to go with you. So they're riding your coattail, but they're not seeing that there is a halt, there's a yield sign going on. We're not at the stop sign yet, but there's a yield. Something is wrong, even if we cannot identify what it is. And I'm going to go to Tiffany. Tiffany.
So a question that I asked you before when we had connected, I loved your answer for it. And so I want to ask you the same question again as it relates to the hypermania and the increased dopamine levels. So in the military and in athletes, or anybody going to the gym, I'm thinking you want higher dopamine levels. So with that, and I think in the military environment, we want those higher levels of dopamine to be that go-getter and great leader. So at what point did you realize that that was a problem? And then the second part of that is, at what point did you realize after the military that you wanted to go get yourself checked out to see what was going on with you?
Hi, Tiffany. Great to see you. So, yes, to what you said, that you want the dopamine, but it does enhance performance. But you can have this increased dopamine without being bipolar. So you could have a lot of these conditions without having bipolar disease, and risking everything because of this devastating disease. So that's kind of an unknown situation that you don't really know which way it's going to turn out. As far as my condition, I never, when I was in mania, to include full-blown mania, I never thought there was anything wrong with me, ever. I thought I was the smartest guy in the world. I felt fantastic. Anybody that criticized me was out to get me. I felt wonderful, and there was nothing wrong. And then I was even evaluated 3 times after I got fired, because I was ordered to go see the doctor. 3 times I was evaluated, and when I was in full-blown mania, and the doctor said, fit for duty, there's nothing wrong, you're perfectly fine. So it wasn't until after I got fired, I then, in the next few months, I spiraled, then crashed into terrible, hopeless, crippling depression with terrifying psychosis. And that went on for about 4 months. And I went in to see the doctor again. I'd clawed my way in. And now this is the 7th time I've gone to the doctor over the past several years. 3 times with depression, 3 times with mania, and then this 7th time with depression. And I told the doctor, there's something wrong with me. I don't know what it is, but I'm normally high energy and essentially manic. And they were able then, with some input from my wife, to reach the conclusion and diagnose me with bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis. I gave the doctor a big hug and said, thank you. Now I've got a diagnosis, a label, a face on the target, and I can start trying to get myself well. I said, I'm going to own this disease. I'm not going to be stigmatized. I'm not going to be embarrassed or ashamed, because that makes no sense. Because, bipolar disorder is every bit as physiological as diabetes, cancer, heart disease. So I'm not going to have any of that. And I was completely open about it from day one after my diagnosis in November 2014. But unfortunately, the medications that I got for the next number of years didn't work. They just made me sleepy. And I went from bad to worse into bipolar hell. Terrible, horrible, frightening psychosis, crippling depression, until finally I was hospitalized at a VA hospital. And then over the next several months, I was able to get the right medications, principally lithium, that stabilized my brain chemistry and got me on my journey of recovery. Just a couple things also. When I got admitted to the inpatient ward because the doctor detected I had passive suicidal ideations where I didn't want to kill myself, but I wanted somebody else or something else to take my life. And he was so concerned, he said, "Hey, you need to stay with us for a while." So I ended up spending a total of 6 weeks in the VA hospital, which was a pretty good stay. They did me a lot of good. But then finally, when we got the lithium in the formula, things started going up.
Wow. I see Ron Veazie has his hand up. So Ron, you want to ask a question or make a comment?
Ask something here. Most people are not trained to recognize if you have anything that's really wrong with you. So I guess what I'm asking is, you have to kind of watch how you approach other people. So what would be the recommendation from a person who's really worried about their friend or somebody they work with versus a person who, I mean, let's just be real, some people are trying to get you or make you look bad. So what would be the best approach without going maybe directly to the individual or their chain without saying, I think this person is nuts or crazy, just saying, these are the things I see. Is that something we should be worried about or something we should get involved in?
Great
What would be
question.
the best approach?
Yeah, super question. I think that first off, every organization should have a peer support network. And that's kind of a fancy word for what the military calls a battle buddy system, where every single person in the military or in the civilian world or wherever has a buddy that they get to know, that they have certain responsibilities to look out for them, to take care of them, to be completely candid and honest. And all of this is laid out in a program that is essentially strengthened by the culture of the organization. And so if you're a battle buddy and you start seeing something going wrong with your friend or your buddy or your peer support person, you have a responsibility to say, "Hey, look, I'm your friend. I care about you. I love you. I'm compassionate, but I'm worried because here are the symptoms I'm starting to see." And remember that class we took on mental health and mental illness symptoms and signs? Here's what I'm seeing in you. And this is very, very concerning. And if we don't get this taken care of, it could lead to the end of your marriage, your family, your career, could lead to addiction, homelessness, prison, and death. So I want to get you some help, because if you get medical help, then there's a very good chance you can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life. So let's go see the local therapist or psychiatrist or social worker who's trained in this stuff, and I'll go with you, and we'll go together as a team, as battle buddies, and I'll be there to make you feel more comfortable. I think that's the way to handle it.
I like that.
There's a question in the chat from Sylvina. The question that she's asking is, while you were in the military, were you ever labeled as a toxic leader?
That's a good question.
No, I never was. For the most part, I was labeled as super inspirational, motivational, et cetera, et cetera. However, when I wrote the book, which the name of the book is Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness. When I wrote the book, I went back and interviewed as many people as I could find from the time I was, a West Point cadet, second lieutenant, all the way up to two-star general. And it was very, very interesting results. So from second lieutenant, West Point, up until battalion level command, nothing but super enthusiastic, inspirational motivation, follow you anywhere, just great reports from my subordinates. Then when I was a battalion commander as a lieutenant colonel in 05 with about 20 years service, I was at that point, I was getting much, much closer to the actual onset of bipolar disorder. My behavior started to get more bizarre. I started not only seeing myself as a combat commander in charge of, global mission to deploy, fight, win, bring everybody home alive. I started seeing myself as kind of a rock star, a superstar, an entertainer. I was the funniest guy in the room. Everybody loved me. And people pointed out when I went back and interviewed them, they said, you were a really terrific battalion commander and you were great to work for, but you started getting really weird. Like, you started acting more like some kind of rock star than a lieutenant colonel in the Army. And then that increased when I was a brigade commander as an 06, as a colonel. And then that observation continued for the next couple assignments as I became more of a rock star in my own mind. And people thought it was weird and bizarre. And they told me so in my interviews. But then where it really started to turn, and people probably did think I was a toxic leader, was at National Defense University, where I was so grandiose, so much religiosity, thought I was the apostle, working for the chairman. It went to my head. I was driving change relentlessly at a pace that was unsustainable. I was going too fast for the organization. People couldn't keep up with me, and I just kept pushing harder and harder and harder. And I started getting more impatient. And when people resisted and said, hey, you need to slow down or back off or dial back, whatever, I saw them as enemies who were out to get me. And then that fed these paranoid delusions. And at that point, I think people who were at odds with me saw me as a toxic leader. And that was really only in about the last year of my Army career.
Wow.
There's another question in the chat, but before we get to that, Mary Stanley has a question.
Hi, sir. It's an honor to meet you. I read your book, which was the inspiration to me starting my own organization. My question for you is, in the military, I'm 15-year veteran Army also. And is there a correlation between post-war syndrome and the trauma and the depression and the anxiety when you get out compared to with the bipolar issue when you're in?
I think, go ahead, Nola.
Well, I wanted to clarify kind of, and just to seek some clarity in the question. You're looking at some correlation between the trauma that people experience in the military and get out and how they deal with it with bipolar?
Well, a lot of mental health issues are not diagnosed in the military. You're fine, you're good for duty, keep going. And so, I've experienced a lot of anxiety stuff when I got out. I was fine the whole time I was in. And the more clients I've worked with, because I work with trauma victims and post-war syndrome with veterans that come out. And I've noticed that there's an increasing number that have been undiagnosed with bipolar issue while they were in the military, end up with more mental health issues when they get out, even though they were fine the whole time they were in. And they struggle with like the transition issues of being able to transition out into the real world. And I'm just wondering, how much experience you had to deal with that when you got out.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that when you're serving in the military, even though it's very stressful and there's a lot of pressure and there can be trauma, and that's on the bad side. On the good side, one of the things the military does is it gives a lot of structure, routine, discipline. It gives you a mission, a purpose. And so those two things, that's the positive side of the military. And then you brought up the negative side. I think the positive side can balance out and sort of suppress some of the bad stuff, and it kind of keeps you, between the white lines. It keeps you on the rails and keeps you functioning. And when you leave the military and you transition out, suddenly your mission's gone. What's your purpose? You don't have the structure and the routine and physical training at 0600 every morning, and things like that. And so you lose a lot of that. And so your life kind of becomes unstructured and it starts kind of coming apart. And it's really important in transition to put something back together in the military's place. Like with me, I got really, really sick at the very end of my Army career, and it almost killed me. I mean, many doctors have said that when I was in full-blown mania, I was lucky I didn't have a heart attack or a stroke, or an encounter. I almost got arrested twice by the police for belligerent behavior. I mean, I could have been shot by the cops or thrown in jail and killed. And so I was lucky I made it to the end of my career, and then I had the complete breakdown, bipolar hell. And that lasted for 2 years, and it almost killed me. And all I wanted to do was die every day, just die. And I had all these visions of how I would die. But once I got on the right medication and I got my brain chemistry squared away, then I started to recover. And I said, okay, I need to rebuild my life. I need a purpose, a mission. I need routine. I need to go to bed, every night at the same time, get 8 hours of sleep, go do PT every single day and stay in really good shape, find stress reduction techniques, mindfulness, do yoga, run on the beach, lift weights. And so I rebuilt my life, and that's taken me a few years. But where I'm at now, my purpose is sharing my bipolar story to help stop the stigma, promote recovery, and save lives. And I do it through speaking, writing, and conferring. And I mean, this is my job. I do it every day, and I'm having a blast. This is more fun than anything I ever did in the Army. So, I think what you said is true, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to counter it. And a lot of that is by working with a good psychiatrist and a therapist, and really bringing in the people close to you, your spouse, your family, close friends, and letting them know what your condition is. And here are the warning signs. If you see these signs, please come talk to me so we can get back on the right track.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary, for that question. I have a comment and a question from Hope Valentine. First of all, she said, thank you, General Martin, so much for sharing your journey. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, retired Air Force officer, and my question is, how do the military address the issues or the issue that their system, I'm missing something here, of training that is mission focused and forces some mental health issues? The stigma of seeking help is unfathomable, unfathomable to a troop, and that's true. I worked in the mental health field my last 10 years in the military, and there was a stigma. If you came to mental health, the thought was either you were going to get kicked out because you were not fit for duty, or if you were still deemed fit for duty, you were looked on differently.
Yeah, so great question. First off, the military is always going to put the mission first. It just is, because that's why we have a military, is to accomplish the mission, whatever that mission is. But the people are absolutely critical. Without the people, healthy, fit, motivated, with good morale, you won't accomplish the mission. So you need both. You absolutely need to have both. I think the military did a terrible job on mental health for a long, long time. Like when I came in the 1970s and the 80s, nobody talked about mental health. It wasn't discussed. And if someone did have a mental health problem, they were whisked away, out of the unit, gone. You never saw them again. Their name was never spoken again. But it started to change with the Vietnam generation, in starting to understand post-traumatic stress, whether you call it disorder or not, but PTS or PTSD. And they started teaching us about that. And then the 9/11 hit, and we went into a 20-year war with the same troops going back over and over again. And so now you not only had lots of PTSD, you had a lot of depression. You started getting traumatic brain injuries, survivor's guilt, moral injury, bipolar disorder, started getting all kinds of mental health injuries and conditions. And the military then started learning and saying, wait a second, this makes no sense to medically discharge people who have PTSD if it can be managed and they can perform. It makes no sense to discharge somebody with depression, even if they take medication, if they can do the job. And they started looking at every single case on a case-by-case basis. And over a period of years, I think the military has really improved the way it evaluates and treats people with mental health conditions. In fact, today, I've talked to a whole bunch of military psychiatrists. They bend over backwards to accommodate and retain people who have mental conditions because the military has spent so much money and resources to train them. They don't want to lose them. So I think the military has gotten a lot smarter. The only two conditions that I'm aware of that are pretty much are going to get medically boarded are bipolar disorder type 1, which is what I have, and then schizophrenia. So other than that, people are serving. Even bipolar disorder type 2 people are serving. So what do we need to do? We need more training, more education. We need to change the culture. Talking about mental health needs to be normalized, not stigmatized. And we need to educate the troops, the service members, that, hey, if you have a problem, go get help. It's okay to not be okay. They have to believe that they're not going to get penalized and, that they're going to get kicked out, not promoted, security clearance taken, because it's actually not really true anymore, but it's still believed to be true in the culture of the military. I gave a talk to the Navy about a month ago, and we had on the panel, we had some psychiatrists, Navy psychiatrists. And the Navy sailors all said, oh, if I go for help, I'm going to get kicked out. Won't get promoted. It'll end my career. And the psychiatrist said, no, that's not true. And explained how the system works, how they evaluate each situation, what does kick in a medical evaluation board. And so it was really an eye-opener for me, but there's a huge gap on understanding between the medical experts who actually run the program and the service members who are, the troops. So we have some work to do there.
We have some work to do, General. I see Selvina's hand is up, so I'm going to go to her. Selvina, what's your question?
Actually, it's Joe,
Joe.
asking a question. Hello, sir. My name is Joe Wilkes. I'm still in the military. I came in '81, and I'm under that stigma. Had been for a long time. It's just starting to change for me. Where if you have an issue, depression, mental illness, that type of thing, it's okay to tell someone. And I'm in the intelligence field, so that's always a concern for me. But my question for you is, as what you've gone through and the book that you've written, are you an advisor to the military now to help form the future of mental illness awareness? Over.
I'm
Good
not.
question.
Great question. I'm not an official advisor. I actually got the Navy nominated me to be on the Secretary of Defense's Council on Mental Health and Mental Illness, but I didn't get picked. So they didn't pick me. But I didn't have the book out then either. So maybe in the future they'll pick me to be an actual advisor. So the way it works with the military is they're on their own. I try as hard as I can to tell my story, to make sure people know that I was almost destroyed by mental illness, and then I came back from the ashes, and I had a successful career, and then I was almost destroyed. And so the Army has invited me, many commands in the Army have invited me to speak to them, to the troops, to the whole command. And I give my talk, and we do Q&A discussion, have a little leaders seminar. So I've done a whole bunch of things for the Army. same with the Navy. The Navy has invited me to do a whole bunch of events, including speaking to all the new one-star admirals, two-star admirals, new command master chiefs, new senior executive service. So the Navy and the Army have been really kind of, the most supportive and interested in my story. I haven't had a chance to talk to the Air Force, the Coast Guard, or the Marine Corps yet, but I think I may have a chance with the Marines in May. So the other thing, it's with the VA. The VA I have given 3 talks to the VA, but they are very bureaucratic and they're reticent to bring in anybody to talk. They're just hard to penetrate and they have so many rules. But to veteran support groups, I've spoken to dozens and dozens of sort of nonprofit groups. The other has been Fortune 500 companies, super interested in this. And then the medical community has been unbelievable. I mean, med schools, hospitals, professional medical associations, they have embraced me like you wouldn't believe. There's professors that are using my book to teach medical school classes on psychiatry. And it is remarkable. And they call somebody like me an expert by lived experience.
Yeah.
So I have these super smart professors. They embrace me and we're like a team together. Martin, the knuckle dragger, Army guy, and then this super smart professor. So anyway, that's a little. The other thing about the book that's interesting is it's selling all around the world, and it's being translated right now into Chinese and Portuguese down in Brazil.
Fantastic. I want to know if there's anybody else had a question. Dr. Lopez. Now, Dr. Lopez is one of the trainers who work in my company, V Solutions Consulting, and we talk a lot about co-occurring disorders, but also the link to from co-occurring disorder to substance use disorder. You alluded a little bit to, using substances like alcohol to deal with the mania. You want to elaborate a little bit about on that? Because we see a lot of people who use substances to deal with mental health issues, to deal with mental illness, whether it's uppers to deal with their depression, like meth, or alcohol to deal with the mania, to take a little bit of the edge off the mania. Would you like to elaborate a little bit about using any type of chemical to deal with your manic depression as a
Yes.
use of alcohol?
So when I was manic, the higher my mania went, the more I wanted to drink alcohol. And of course, that's the only substance that, I was aware of that I could do legally in the military. So that's the only one I took. And the only thing I did was after duty. I never drank during duty hours. But so as I was manic, I wanted to drink. And as I drank, I got more manic. And as I got more manic, I wanted to drink more. And so it was this crazy cyclone of going further and further up. And so the alcohol fueled the mania. On the other side, when I was depressed, it's the opposite. I was depressed. I felt terrible. I tried all these different things, PT, prayer, Bible verses, intense music, inspirational things. But at the end of the day, they didn't work. And so I turned to alcohol. And the alcohol, it made me feel good while I was drinking it. It was just a temporary relief. But then I would get more depressed. And so the more I drank, the more depressed I got. The more depressed I got, the more I wanted to drink. And it was a negative downward cycle. So it was just the inverse opposite of the mania. But I think it's really, they call it a form of self-medication. I mean, I was very sick. I didn't know I was sick. I had no idea that I had bipolar disorder at that time. And I just knew I needed something to make me feel better. And alcohol is an easy one to take. And it does have pretty much immediate effects on the brain.
Yes. I want to get other people involved. If you have a question or a comment for the general, you could put it in the chat or you could just speak your question. Anybody have a question? So we're talking a lot about military, but there's which a springboard also to entrepreneurs, to people who are in the civilian work. And I know that we have some of you who have never been in the military, but you're entrepreneurs and you can identify with high performers who might in fact have bipolar disorder. So if you have a question, if you have a comment, please raise your hand. And I see Selvina or Joe have their hand risen. Selvina or Joe?
This is Selvina. General Morton, first and foremost, I want to say thank you for, just taking this time to share with us your experience, not just in the military, but even after the military. It's truly commendable. I have two comments. One, thus far, my first takeaway from this gathering is that it is possible to be predisposed to bipolar and it not be manifested until some event triggers it. So is that correct?
That is correct.
Yes. Yep.
That is correct. And then the second thing is early education, early diagnosis, and treatment can prevent someone from going into full mania, if you will, reaching the point that you reached back in 2014. Is that correct?
That's a really good question. In other words, like in my case, if someone had identified that I was, on this bipolar spectrum and moving up, and there had been an early intervention and I had taken the effective medication, could it have prevented me from going up, 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 and then ultimately, exploding? I would like to think it's possible, but I don't really know. I'm going to turn over to Nola to answer that part.
Yeah, so one of the things that I did in the military is I ran a group for women with bipolar disorder, and even the women on medication. And there were times that things like even going through their cycle will trigger a manic episode. Now, for them, it wasn't as severe. They might go shopping a lot, or maybe cheating, or doing things that were inappropriate. So even though they were on medication and they got earlier intervention, I would know that it's early. By the time they saw me, they were already diagnosed with bipolar. But it mitigated some of the symptoms, so it wasn't as extreme. I don't know that it will fully stop it unless they're on the right medication. And I know, General Martin, you are on lithium, which is a really heavy duty type of medication, and there's some side effects to lithium, and you have to have, often you have to get blood tests to make sure your lithium levels are okay. And so a lot of people don't want to take lithium, so they take other medications that maybe they're not as strong, not as effective, so they have these breakthrough periods of mania. I would call it more hypomania. But even with early intervention, other factors can trigger a manic episode. And I know for the patients that I had, they would have sometimes, periods of mania. I think the medication did mitigate some of their behavior, but that's a tough one, Selvina, but it's a very good question. Dr. Lopez, you want to chime in on that one? Dr. Lopez is also a clinical psychologist.
I'm sorry. I was asking something right now. So
Oh, okay.
I wasn't.
Well, go ahead and ask your question, and if you have any feedback regarding early intervention and
This kind of goes along, like I was thinking in terms of early intervention as well, because so I think that there's multiple factors that could impact early intervention. And early intervention, for example, in your situation, I mean, that kind of sticks out to me that, had you just gotten the right intervention sooner, it didn't have to get to that point, right? I mean, just in terms of the longevity of your career, or you being able to kind of transition in a different way instead of having to go through like your symptoms deteriorating to the degree that they did, right? So I think early intervention is a huge priority. You're at a point where you were in danger, right? And you could potentially hurt yourself or hurt someone else, especially with these conditions when they get very severe. So I think that early intervention is a priority. I do, as you were describing your earlier symptoms of hypomania, just listening to the symptoms alone, it made me wonder, well, were you initially dealing with misdiagnosis as well? Did you have some trouble on that front? Like, it sounds like there was the stigma. There was a problem with you having your condition being acknowledged. And I can see how, like, the pressure of the military career itself must have been a huge factor in that. But then on top of that, I think because your symptoms weren't severe yet, it sounds like that could pose some difficulty in kind of really teasing out what's going on there. Do you feel like you struggled, or maybe even the providers that evaluated could have struggled with figuring out what was really going on? Was there like misdiagnosis? Did you experience misdiagnosis, like somebody giving you a different condition?
Well, so my onset was in 2003 in Iraq, and I was manic practically the whole year of combat. Then when we went home to Germany, I crashed into depression for 10 months. And then I had other periods of depression over the next several years. And 3 different times when I was depressed, I went in to see the doctor and said, "Hey, doctor, there's something wrong with me. I'm depressed." I'm never depressed. I'm always upbeat, full of energy. What's wrong with me? And each time they said, "You're fine. You're not depressed. There's nothing. You don't need anything. Just keep doing what you're doing." But they were flat wrong, because I was clearly in a bipolar cycle going from mania into depression. So those 3 times, they were just wrong. And I knew something was wrong with me in the depressed state. When I was in the manic state, I didn't think there was anything wrong with me at all. I thought I was Superman. So no, absolutely no feeling of something wrong to be evaluated until after I got fired 4 months later, November of 2014. Then I was in the worst depression of my life with horrible psychosis. And then I went into the doctor on my own and said, "I am really sick. What is wrong with me?" And they were able to finally piece together bipolar disorder type 1.
I have a question in the chat from Hope, and then I see Juliet has her hand up. Hope wants to know, is there a genetic predisposition? Those are not her words, but she said, does genetics play a role?
Yes. Yeah, very, very strong role. And that wasn't authoritatively established until a little over a decade ago. So, I've got 2 sons who live with bipolar disorder as well. And they were both, their onset was as teenagers. They were diagnosed at 17. So they were actually diagnosed before I was. And in, dealing with all the doctors and everything, it never once came up that, hey, there's a genetic component to this. Hey, General Martin, we need to look at you too, since you are the father of 2 sons with bipolar disorder. Never came up once.
That's amazing, General. Juliet, you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment actually, just having heard what the symptoms look like and thinking about my time in the corporate workplace, I wonder how many people are in the corporate workplace that are going through this, where the stress and the demand to perform is so strong, the competition is so strong that people would not want to even admit that something is going on, or they may not even know. But just hearing this today just heightened my awareness that there may have been so many people in the workplace going through that, and some not knowing, and also not willing to admit or to face it, that this is what's happening with them because of the competition in the corporate space as well.
That is really good, Juliet. I want to give 2 more symptoms, a couple more symptoms. One of the other symptoms is distractibility. The person becomes distracted very easily. However, ADHD and ADD also make people distracted. So it's hard then to decide, is your distractibility as a result of something else? So there's a conglomeration of symptoms. They have to meet criteria according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5 in order to be diagnosed, whether it's bipolar 1, which is more centered on the manic, bipolar 2, which has more of a hypomania and have some of the same symptoms, or cyclothymia, which is a cycle of ups and downs, but it's very low grade. The other thing is mood disturbance. You know, the person may appear very moody, but it's to the point where it affects their job, it affects their relationship, it affects everything around them. So there are things that, well, I was going to say a professional could see, but General Martin had what, 3 professionals or more, and none of them diagnosed him, even though his 2 boys were diagnosed. That's amazing to me that they missed that.
Yeah, looking back, it is totally amazing that I was, 3 times with depression, 3 times with, full-blown mania. So 6 times I was evaluated, given a clean bill of health, said you're perfectly fine. All 6 times, just they were dead wrong.
And seeing that there is a familial or a genetic component to bipolar.
Right.
Wow. I really appreciate, Dr. Lopez, she just raised her hand. You have a question or a comment, Dr. Lopez?
Yes, I mean, just thinking in terms of that, I wonder how would you suggest, or what are your thoughts in terms of like how we could provide more education around that too, so that people, because it sounds like it has to start with the person realizing that there's something going on, or, to be able to, for the person to be able to kind of like look at themselves and because it sounds like your instincts were there, you felt something was wrong, but then there needs to be that reassurance, and so that knowledge alone and education might have been helpful for you to be able to then go and advocate for yourself. So I'm just wondering, like, how could that be provided a little bit better?
Well, I think across society in general, the business world, individual businesses, the military, et cetera, there needs to be a stronger, better thought out effort to educate and train people on what the common symptoms are, so people have some base level of understanding, which the thousands of people that I served with for over a decade did not have. I mean, nobody knew they're next to a guy who is intensely bipolar. They didn't know because they had no education or no training. So I think that needs to be first. The second thing is, I think to expect someone who is in a state of mania to think or suspect there's something wrong with them is a bridge too far. It's not going to happen, because when you're manic, you're high as a kite. I mean, I had doctors tell me that the level of mania I was at was significantly higher than the strongest cocaine or ecstasy drugs. That my brain was that far out of control. So you don't think there's anything wrong because you feel like Superman and are on top of the world. But where it changes is when you're in depression. Like with me, I knew there was something wrong, and I told the doctors, but they couldn't pick it up. They didn't have a way of discerning it. And I think that the biggest shortfall was, I mean, I think the doctors were all trained at their job. They all knew what they were supposed to be doing, and they had studied, the books about what bipolar was and everything, but they didn't get collateral information. None of them did. None of them worked they just talked to me, one-on-one. So what they should have done, like when I went in for depression 3 times, they should have talked to my wife, a family member, my work colleagues, and said, well, how is then, Colonel General Martin, how is he normally? Oh, he's full of energy. He's interested in everything. He's go. He doesn't sleep. And now look at him. He's confused. He's withdrawn. He's isolated. He has no energy, no interest. And then the doctor could have pieced that together and probably figured out, oh, wow, that kind of sounds like a mood disorder, bipolar. Same thing when I was in mania and was ordered to go see the doctor 3 times, and they said you're fine. If there had been collateral information, they could have detected it. One of the things they should have done, I mentioned that, my workforce, basically, when I went completely off the rails and became unhinged, they wrote letters to my boss, the chairman, saying, here's what we're seeing. We don't know what's wrong with General Martin, but here's the behaviors we're seeing. And it's really disturbing. It's scary. It's frightening. It's disruptive. It's really bad for the university. And those doctors should have gone and got that information and read the reports. But I also fault the military chain of command for not giving that stuff to the doctors. So the military's holding all this really precious data. They don't give it to the doctors, and the doctors don't ask for it. So what a complete breakdown of, really bad communication. The only time that they did use collateral information was the 7th time I went in when I was depressed. When they finally diagnosed me, they asked my wife what her opinion was, and she said, well, I think he was manic, and now he's obviously depressed. And they were able to take that, that little statement from my wife and put it together. And I was obviously depressed. And they had seen me just months earlier in a manic state. And then they were able to, with confidence, diagnose me with bipolar disorder.
General Martin, I have a question from Joe. By the way, Joe is still active duty. I'm proud of him. That's my brother-in-law, Sabina's husband. I just want to give him a shout out. He says, sir, is it a cycle from manic to depression? And I'll let you talk, and then I'll explain that cycle a little better.
It sort of depends. Like in my case, during my run with severe bipolar disorder from, the Iraq War in 2003 till 2016 when I started lithium. So what was that, a period of 13 years of, really serious, significant, acute bipolar disorder. Most of my time, I would say 85 to 90% was in a state of mania. So it wasn't this kind of regular up down. I was mostly up, and then I would come down and I would be balanced for a while. And then I might go up again. And then I might be balanced. And then I might plunge into depression for several weeks or a few months. And so it wasn't this regular sine wave. It was much more erratic than that. And again, me, mostly mania for 90% of the time, quite a bit of even keel where I was just fine. I wasn't manic. I wasn't depressed. And then, a significant amount of depression, probably 10, 15% of the time. And those depressions would last anywhere from a couple hours to a couple days to weeks to months, and then to 2 years. I was depressed for 2 years after I left the military.
And that is pretty common with bipolar 1. Where the cyclothymia, there's more of a wave where you have some periods, but because it's hypomania, you have some periods where you're hypomanic and then you're in not a very low depression. And so those are more rapid cycling. But with bipolar 1, you have periods of high, and then you have periods that seem normal before you crash. I see Dr. Lopez and Tiffany. I'm going to go to Dr. Lopez because she had her hand up first. Dr. Lopez, you have a question, and then Tiffany.
I was just wondering, with you had mentioned, like, kind of the fact that there wasn't the collateral information gathered, but did they also not include like a questionnaire forms to be able to gather the symptoms? Because that's one thing that I would always encourage, is that with diagnostics and being really trying to tease out a diagnosis, and especially like trying to identify manic symptoms and hypomanic symptoms, it can be so much more helpful to have like formal questionnaires that a person fills out, especially because, like you mentioned, if the person themselves can't have the insight into it, they just answer some questions, true, false, and then the data itself will inform the person doing the examination. So did you ever have a chance to fill out forms? Was that ever provided?
That's a great question. and my memory is kind of fading on that regard. I think that I did. I mean, because usually when you go to the doctor, you always fill out forms and questionnaires, and so my guess is that I probably did, just because I hardly remember ever going to the doctor and not filling out paper. So I probably did.
Yeah, there should have been an intake and an assessment portion. Anytime you go to mental health, especially in the military, we do intakes, we do assessments, and we also provide we do testing. So there should have been. I know I don't know in the Army, but I know in the Air Force we did each time. When we did the intake, you do the screening, you do the intake and assessment, and we provide some type of test in psychometrics so that we can, if even if we can't see it firsthand, by the conversation, the psychometrics or the testing will provide that information. Tiffany.
Okay, so along those lines, and I'm not saying this is right, but I think in his case, and in many people's case in the military, the symptoms are not looked at as a symptom, but rather something that's applauded. So when General Martin is thinking he's Superman and he's acting like he's Superman, the military loves that. And that's probably what got him up to the 2-star level. So he had all of these great assignments and positions. And I think that those manic episodes is what pushed him that way. So, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist outside of the military, but in the military, that kind of mindset is a positive attribute. So that could be one reason why it was not something noticed as being a mental health issue. Again, I'm not sure. I'm not a mental health professional, but then the other piece too, with the question that was asked about, like what are some things that can be done? Well, I think his story is a perfect example of that. Is that it's not just the individual that has to be aware, because in his mind, nothing was wrong. Everything was great. But it got to a point to where other people saw it. So I think the training needs to be, hey, you need to be aware of it so that you can possibly identify it in somebody else. Because that could be the very thing. So like, let's say his wife or General Dempsey, General Dempsey, maybe if he had gotten some training, and I'm not hitting him either, but if he had some kind of knowledge or input or information about what bipolar is, he might have been able to say, hey, love you like a brother, but you're fired. Instead of saying that, he could say, love you like a brother. Have you explored something like bipolar? So I think the education needs to come to everybody so that everybody can recognize it and then have the courage to say to somebody, you might want to explore these things.
That's true. That is true, Tiffany. I have a comment, and Francis, do you mind asking it? Because I think coming from you or telling us what you're sharing there. Go ahead, Francis.
Well, I worked at the Warrior Transition Unit, and I also was there when they changed over from Warrior Transition into the Soldier Recovery Unit. And in that space, General Dempsey, he has a whole team, a medical team, and they advise him on the soldier's condition. Before the SRU, the WTU was only for Reserve and National Guard soldiers because they didn't have a unit camaraderie that they can fall back on in order to get the care that they need, to get the support that they need. Now they have where all branches of the Army, they can have access to this particular unit. In this unit, they identify, like if a unit, they find that someone has highs and lows, they're erratic, they're not figuring out what's going on with the soldier, they'll send them, they'll ask whatever post general, hey, can we put this person in your SRU so you can identify what's going on with them? And once they identify what's going on with them, they have things in place where they're treating, they're educating, and they're bringing everybody in. They're not just taking care of soldiers and then sending them back out to the wolves. They literally bring them in, they talk to the units, they do a whole medical board, they get the post general involved, and everybody, it's a whole team that's actually in making sure that the soldiers' readiness, their mental state is not looked at as some sort of pariah, but they're looked at as, hey, these are people that they need that support. They need a system that, hey, look, you're not going to get reprimanded because something happened. And so the whole medical and behavioral health field has leaps and bounds changed.
Wow.
And that was just recently since I've been in.
That is amazing, and I applaud that. That is good. Thank you for telling us that, Francis, because I didn't know. I don't know. You said all branches, so the Air Force is doing some of that as well. Thank you. Leslie, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, more of a comment. Just first of all, I wanted to thank the General for sharing his story with us on tonight. I've learned way more about this than I've ever known, even in this short period of time. So thank you all for sharing. And also, I'm not former military, but I do have over 30 years civil service. So I'm very familiar with the military and the environment and the rank structure, how you may not want to approach a 2-star about being off the rails. So I thank you for that information, General. Also, what I'm going to take away from here is we have to continue to advocate for ourselves. As you said, you went to the doctor several times, and not only in the space of mental health, but anything. We know when something is wrong with our bodies. Yeah. So we have to continue to advocate for ourselves and not just listen to what the doctor tells us that we're okay. So I will take that point away. And also the training piece is critical because the symptoms you mentioned are things we see every day. The high performers, the people with all the energy, the people working 12 hours. So the symptoms are very interesting to me. So I thank you for heightening my awareness in this area. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Leslie. You see people working more than 12 hours, people working 16 hours. I don't know how they do that every single day. And especially for us who are entrepreneurs, now we are driven because you're told you have to be successful. And in order to do that, you have to be in the grind. You hear that over and over and over. And you have coaches that are supporting that, that are reinforcing that. So I'm glad that I have civilians here. I'm glad that I have military supporters, military, ex-military, all of you. I am so grateful that you guys came out and asked the questions that you asked. But I'm grateful, General Martin, I know how busy you've gotten, especially in the last few weeks. It just took off for you. That book is doing wonderful. So I am so grateful that you took the time to come and share with us. And I know you're going to be advocating. We're going to be doing some things, partnering and doing some things, probably in the future, bringing you on so that you can talk more, especially to people who have substance use disorder that do not have a mental health diagnosis, but they have a substance use disorder diagnosis. And we work with people who are in prison. And when you talk to them, perhaps had they been properly diagnosed, some of the things that they did would not have landed them in prison. And so that's another population to come and speak to. Does anybody else have a question? Or, oh, I see Dr. Lopez, you have something in the chat. You want to go ahead and
Oh, I was just responding in the chat because somebody had mentioned that, you know, the forms that people fill out as they're going to see patients. But I just realized as we were talking, you know, after I had asked that as a patient, you really wouldn't be able to distinguish what type of forms you're being given. So that's a lot harder from the patient side. So without really knowing, because there's a huge difference in the type of questionnaires you can be given. Yes, you go to the doctor, you're always going to be given some questionnaires, but that's not necessarily symptom specific. It's not necessarily comprehensive either, or how comprehensive it is in terms of really being able to differentiate symptoms between conditions, all of that. There's so many different types of evaluations. So that's the tricky part.
Again, General Martin, thank you for your time. We've been talking back and forth for the last 2 weeks, and I want to thank Tiffany for introducing us. I was supposed to be on a podcast. She's been trying for a long time to gather us up. It didn't work out. She got you on. I am so glad that you joined her on her podcast and that she linked us up. Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you, Tiffany, for being here and supporting. I want to thank everybody just for being here. My friend Juliet, she wasn't in the military, but she came and supported. She's not even in the field, but she came and supported us. Thank you so much. Hope Valentine, we served together in the Air Force, and I thank you for coming. I thank Selvina and Joe for joining us. Any last, not question, but comments before we sign off? And again, my last comment is thank you all for coming. Thank you, General.
Hey, first off, it was great to be on with you. Fantastic job. And thanks to the audience. Wonderful questions. Some resources. We already mentioned my book. And don't listen to me. Listen to the medical community. They think it's fantastic. I've got a website that's chock full of information, and it's bipolargeneral.com.
I think
Articles.
Tiffany put it in there. Let me make
talks,
sure. Put it in the
link. There's a company that has been doing resilience mental health work called grithope.com. They've got some really good resources. There's a device, it's a new innovation. It's called biaffect.com, biaffect.com. It's a new technique. It's a new technology that's with your iPhone that can detect mood changes in the onset of mania and depression, and then doctors can take proactive steps. And then lastly, there's a wonderful documentary that's being made called brainstormthefilm.com. So all one word, brainstormthefilm.com. It's going to be on PBS a year from now, but it is going to be the best thing ever put out on bipolar disorder.
I know Tiffany's been putting, she's been putting all the different links and all that the General has, all the resources. She's been putting them in the chat. And Tiffany, you're going to be posting that on social media or just on your YouTube channel?
I'm not selfish. I'm going to share it.
Share it with us, Tiffany. So also, guys, listen to Tiffany's. She has some really good guests on her podcast. So if you get a chance, connect with Tiffany on LinkedIn and listen to her podcast.